Today we are going to talk about economic safety. The reality is such that the overwhelming majority of people evaluate the quality of state governance by the purchasing power of their wages and what is in stores and can be bought with their wages. And everything that concerns the ideas of social significance, philosophy, from their point of view, this is not relevant. And therefore, from the entire cycle, for many, this is the most relevant conversation, since it touches on questions of economics. I'll start with a quote. The book 40 Years in the Government by Nikolai Konstantinovich Baibakov. For more than 20 years, he served as chairman of the USSR State Planning Committee. Page 228. If, when I was chairman of the State Planning Committee, they had told me, Comrade Baibakov, you ended the year with an emission of 20 billion rubles, which is not backed by goods coverage, I would go crazy probably. And under Stalin, I would have been accused of sabotage. And if I hadn't been shot right away, I would have been sent to the Gulag for sure. Now this is called the market transition fee. I am far from idealizing the planned economy of the Soviet Union. I am far from thinking that if the Soviet Union had survived, and the state planning had continued to work on the basis of the same scientific methodological support that was in that time, then we would be a prosperous superpower. We would not. Because not everything was in order in the aspect of scientific methodological support, planning, and other stages of the entire function of governance towards the economy of the Soviet Union. Therefore, indeed, by the beginning of perestroika, everything that was mass-produced in the USSR, from a 3-kopeck binder to samples of military equipment, for the most part, one way or the other, was inferior to foreign analogues according to these or those parameters. Another thing is that there was not everything abroad. Therefore, some unique samples were not inferior to anything, since there were no analogues abroad. And now we live in a different time. And what Baibakov said is a thing of the past. Now, representatives of the Central Bank and the Ministry of Economic Development tell us that the Central Bank restrains the money supply, restricts its growth, because it's scared of an increase in inflation, that credit loans are high because inflation is high. And it would be good to get an answer to another question. But what if the central bank did not restrain the money supply, but carried out emission and invested the emitted money in the development of the real sector in such a way that new production facilities were created, existing production facilities were updated, and as a result, some new products would appear which now do not exist. And providing these products to society would improve the quality of life. Would there be inflation or not? But this is only one question, which neither the economists from the Russian Academy of Sciences nor the representatives of the government and the central bank would be able to answer in essence. Therefore, we will have to do something that Lifshitz at one time did not want. Namely, try to understand what the economy is and how it functions. We live on the basis of collective labor, not just labor, but professional labor, specialized labor. And in order for everything to be good, this social unification of labor must somehow be governed. Because the well-being of each and every one, this is not only about production, it is also the distribution of what is produced, the regulation of access to natural resources, both for producers of products and consumers of the final product, and much more. Therefore, if it's about the economic safety of a family and a person somewhere in the Middle Ages, when the peasant household was practically a self-sufficient system in the aspect of production and consumption, and the quality of life was conditioned by personal labor, without any reservations as to whether the state functioned like this or not. Now, any professionalism of any kind, in any sphere of activity, can be devalued by the fact that the latest in the line of Gaidars will come and start the next reforms. And these reforms will be as stupid and harmful as the reforms of the 1990s, which ultimately resulted in economic genocide, for which no one has yet been held accountable, nor, to all appearances, will anyone be. When they say that only ineffective production collapsed, this is a blatant lie, because the Soviet aerospace industry, the fishing navy, the merchant navy in Soviet times were entirely at the world level. In some cases, they set this world level. For example, helicopters designed in the Soviet Union in the 1960s are still the best helicopters in the world, having no analogues, and all modernization is only in the direction of updating the instrument base and replacing old engines with newer, more advanced ones. Nevertheless, Mill Helicopter Company was brought to the brink of bankruptcy during the reform years. Therefore, there are many questions. Nonetheless, the problematics of economic safety is one of the themes on which there is the most graphomania. There are a lot of definitions of what economic safety is. Different authors give different definitions, and the reality is such that none of these definitions can be used in practical politics, for the reason that the definitions stem from governerially and metrologically inconsistent economic theories. If we understand that ensuring economic safety is a governerial task, then, on the basis of the sufficiently general theory of governance, we can define the concept of informational algorithmic safety of governance. This is understood as the ability to achieve the intended objectives of governance with an acceptable level of the quality of governance under conditions of impact on the process of governance of purpose-oriented interference from the outside. That is, the actions of opponents of this conception of governance who adhere to different conceptions of governance under conditions of the inherent noises of the system of governance and the governed object, and also all sorts of natural factors. In other words, it is a governerial task. And, accordingly, with such an approach, ensuring the economic safety of society and the state is a particular case of informational algorithmic safety of governance in general. And, if the informational algorithmic safety of state governance is ensured in the aspect of the economy, then, under some additional conditions, the economic safety of all members of society who are nraviously ethically ready to honestly participate in the social association of labor can be ensured. If we correlate with this picture, which shows the cyclics of solving particular tasks, then the economic safety of society and the state can be considered in a broad sense and in a narrow sense. The difference will be that when considering the economic safety in a broad sense, we need a set of criteria that includes three groups: physical geographical, characterizing the stability of biocenoses; demographic, characterizing the medical biological indicators of the population; and indicators of the cultural consistency of the population, that is, their level of education, parameters of ethics, as well as the number of the population and the characteristics of its migration within the state, which may be conditioned by both physical, geographical, and economic reasons, and also purely economic indicators that characterize the production-consumption system of society, the foreign trade balance, and certain parameters of the financial system. We regularly, every day practically, hear in the news some stories about what is happening on the exchanges. The question is, do these exchange indicators have anything to do with the fact that in the future a rural teacher from the category of consumer standards that is now typical for her will move in the future to a higher category of consumer standards? The reality is such that we are planted with some numbers that have nothing to do with the real parameters that characterize the economy. And if we talk about production, what parameters are needed in the social interest? First, this is the nomenclature of products that are really necessary for society to live and develop in the continuity of generations. And then on each item of the nomenclature, how much is produced, how much is imported, and how it relates to the needs of society as such. If we talk about the effectiveness of the economic system, then there are also indicators that characterize the productivity of labor. That is, how much is produced per employee, either in society in general or in a concrete sector of production. If we turn to Soviet times, then in Soviet times, the Central Statistical Office of the USSR regularly published this kind of information. Now, this kind of information is not published, but it's also interesting that it is of no interest to the deputies of the State Duma during the annual hearing of the government's reports on the successes achieved. The successes are such that under the pretext that the country has not yet outlived the consequences of the 2008 crisis, our economy is either developing slowly or stagnating. And answering the questions of what is happening in it is a problematic theme, since those growth rates, sometimes referred to, are within the margin of error when collecting economic statistics. And after all, it is wanted that the country develop. And accordingly, the term economic safety of the state, in a broad sense, implies ensuring its economic safety in a narrow sense, while satisfying the criteria of physical, geographical, and demographic groups. And the economic safety of the state, in a narrow sense, can be defined as the ability of the economic system of the state to, on the basis of its own production potential, ensure its politics, both external and internal, with all types of natural resources and products, with an acceptable level of sufficiency of consumption, in interaction with external economic entities, in conditions of purpose-oriented counteraction by geopolitical opponents, geopolitical competitors, and the impact of ungoverned natural and intrasocial factors. So, a long definition, it includes a lot of things. But still, this is a governorial task that can be understood. However, the economic safety of the state and the economic safety of society are not the same things. Why? Because the state can be oligarchic in character, and then, for the governing oligarchs, it is acceptable if the economic needs of society are satisfied at a minimum on a leftover principle. And this does not guarantee the safety of society in the future, since the minimum does not allow children to receive the necessary education. Parents do not have time for the upbringing of children because they are forced to work from dawn till dawn for a pittance. An oligarchic state may not be sovereign. That is, it can work for the interests of foreign political forces in relation to which the population of this country, this is simply an economic resource, and the costs of maintaining the resource should also be minimal. But since the external exploiter is interested in the stability of exploitation, he must ensure the economic safety of the governing state as an instrument for the exploitation of the territory and the population in this region. Therefore, the economic safety of society, it is really based in modern times on ensuring the economic safety of the state. But, at the same time, it presupposes the eradication of such a phenomenon as the exploitation of man by man. And this theme in post-Soviet times, and even in post-Stalin times, was outside of discussion, because it was believed that in the USSR there was no exploitation of man by man, although the governing bureaucracy became a real exploiting class that systemically parasitized on the labor and life of the main population. And, from the point of view of the liberal mentality, the exploitation of man by man does not exist in society, since the owner of the enterprise is the employer, and, as an employer, he is a benefactor. He provides jobs, he produces products, thanks to which the poorest person in Europe can now live better in terms of quality, consume what the Tsars, for example in the early Middle Ages, could never have dreamed of. So, where here is exploitation of man by man? An exploitation of man by man is expressed in the fact that people do not have enough free time to bring up children, communicate with each other, and, in order to ensure the consumer minimum, they are forced to work for an unlimited amount of time, sometimes without vacations, at many jobs to the point of wear, live without a family, working somewhere on a shift basis, and so on and so forth. But the theme of exploitation of man by man, and the character of exploitation of man by man in the post-Soviet Russian state is a theme that they do not like to discuss. And, as Dmitry Anatolievich Medvedev said in one of his speeches, that Marxism is an extremist doctrine, since it posed this very question. Nevertheless, let's still look at the possibilities of implementing such a mode of the functioning of the economy, when, from generation to generation, it is stably guaranteed that everyone is fed, shod, dressed, has normal housing. The elderly and those who have lost their ability to work do not live in poverty. They are protected, children receive the right upbringing and education, and adults do not work to breaking point, and they have time to realize their creative potential. If we live in conditions of collective labor, in conditions where no enterprise has a sign of self-sufficiency in the aspect of production and consumption of the products it produces, and depends on supply and sales possibilities, that is, it is a part of the macroeconomic production-consumption system, then the question arises: how to model the development of this system, how to describe it. The answer to this question is that everyone in high school knew what a system of linear equations with n unknowns was, and what to do with it. In fact, the system of linear equations, in which the unknowns are included only in the first degree, is a mathematical model that can describe a multisectoral production-consumption system. Models of this kind have been developed and used since the 20s of the last century. Although we were convinced that the economic genius and Nobel laureate of 1973, Vasily Vasilyevich Leontiev, the author of the balance models named input-output balances, the reality is such that by the time Leontiev emigrated from the Soviet Union, the state planning of the USSR had already been working, and the specifics of the tasks that the state planning solved was such that their solution was impossible if the balance models are not used in one form or another. And the reality is such that the balance models are the only mathematical models that are built on the basis of primary economic data. All other models, production functions, something else, are built on the basis of processing primary data in various algorithms of processing. And then, some simplified models are built that allow solving certain particular tasks. But everything that concerns the governance towards a multisectoral production-consumption system in the state, the reality is such that the balance models are alternativeless. And the only question is how to provide their metrological consistency and to provide a governerial interpretation of what will be as a result. Here again, if you turn to any of the lines of this equation, suppose that x with a certain number is the gross output of a product by a sector within a certain time, for example, a year. If the volume of production X is produced within a year, let's say it is the coal industry, then where does coal go? Do power engineers consume coal? They do. Many power plants operate on coal. Do coke and metallurgy industries consume coal? They do. because carbon is a reducing agent in many iron reduction and steel-making reactions. The chemical industry also uses coal in some cases as a raw material for the production of other types of products, and a certain amount of coal goes for house heating in some areas. At least in the private sector, they also use coal. Accordingly, the question arises as to how much metallurgists need. The answer to this question is simple. Metallurgists need as much coal as they intend to produce cast iron and iron. And how much coal is required according to the technology in order to ensure such an output. That is, it turns out that the share of consumption of products of other sectors by each sector is proportional to its own output. And this circumstance makes it possible to present in each line of the equation the gross output of the sector as the sum of the gross outputs of all other sectors, and the consumers of its products with some coefficients plus F from the English word final, the final product, which goes into the consumption of households and the state apparatus, and, in fact, is that for the sake of which production is carried out. This kind of model is built on the basis of the analysis of accounting for products in physical form. That is, coal in tons, oil in tons or barrels, grain in tons, and so on and so forth. But the reality is such that there are market mechanisms, there is the financial credit system, and all products are produced like goods in the market economy. If we talk about the Soviet planned economy, someone gave such a description that the State Planning Committee of the USSR was the world's largest futures exchange. That is, delivery rates and delivery prices were determined there. In other words, it doesn't matter, one way or another, the cost form of product accounting was present there as well. And if tons are multiplied by prices, then we will get the same equations, in the same structural form, only there will already be a price accounting of production in the cost form. Accordingly, if the coefficients that were here, they are in any case called coefficients of direct costs, and each of them is equal to the amount of production consumed by the sector to which the equation belongs, of another sector per unit of its own output. That is, how many tons of coal are required to produce 1 ton of steel? And in the transition to cost accounting, how much we should pay for coal in order to get 1 ton of our steel at the price of such and such. And if we turn to the cost form of accounting for products, then this is accompanied by some circumstances. Firstly, when we were engaged in building a balance model with the physical form of accounting of products, we got this: 1 technology and 1 sector. If we produce one and the same product on the basis of 2 technologies, then, in the case of physical accounting of products, this is still 1 or 2 sectors. With the cost accounting of products, we can significantly reduce the dimensionality of the task by combining several sectors into one. And for this, there are special algorithms of so-called aggregation. The only question is that in the process of aggregation, we don't lose the cause-effect relationships that internally condition the interaction of sectors with each other. But this is already a task that has nothing to do with the balance methods themselves. This is the task of providing the governerial metrological consistency of balance models. And after we switch to accounting for products in the cost form, the balance model appears in this form. What here is what? Block A characterizes technologies. This is the same set of all direct cost coefficients that we had in our equation. Column F is the final product, for the sake of which we are engaged in production. Column X is a column of aggregate gross capacities, the sectors of those that we included in the balance model. If block A characterizes our production, then we have two more blocks. Block B, which characterizes governance towards production, and block C, which characterizes governance towards consumption. Now let's go along the rows and along the columns of this table. If the table is structurally similar to equations, and we go along the row, then the row initially characterizes the distribution of the products of our sector among all other sectors that need our products for the needs of their own production. In financial terms, what is this? These are the incomes that the sector receives from the sale of its products, and the column characterizes the consumption by our sector of products from all other sectors. That is, as long as we remain within block A, it is we who pay for the supply of raw materials, components, semi-finished products for the needs of our own production, and everything else that we receive from other sectors. But the clear thing is that these are far from all our expenditures in the production process. What else should we pay for? We must pay for the work of the staff, pay taxes, credit loans, some insurance payments, and something else. As a result, one more block appears below block A. In this table, it is represented by one single row. This row includes the named expenditures of all sectors, that is, salaries, taxes, loan payments, insurance payments, depreciation deductions, and so on. All this is called value added, that is, VAT comes from here. Otherwise, it is called factor costs. Why is the model called balance model? Because if we sum up all the factor costs, then we should get the exact cost of the entire final product produced by all sectors. And when Baibakov was horrified by the $20 billion emission that was not backed by goods coverage, it was about the fact that within a year, if the balance model is made in constant prices, some value of the final product was produced. And during this time, the state managed to emit 20 billion, which in some way got here, in Block C, which were not backed by a mass of goods. As a result of which, this very balance ratio was violated, as the total cost of the final product and the total factor costs of all sectors must coincide precisely. And then the question arises: Gaidar, Chubais, and others were wrong. They could not curb Gerashenko, who printed a great deal of money, and as a result, there arose an emission that was not backed by goods coverage. And now many sectors are complaining that they don't have enough working capital in order to conduct production, and the central bank says that it is afraid of inflation and restrains the growth of the money supply. The question arises: how much money do we need in circulation? The answer to this question is two-aspected, even more, three-aspected. The first aspect is related to the fact that the overwhelming majority of the population making everyday purchases should not experience psychological discomfort due to the fact that they have to count a lot in the store. The reality is that the average person normally perceives only the first three significant digits in any number. This corresponds to such a scale of prices when the bulk of goods have prices in the range from a few kopecks to a ruble, 2 digits. When it comes to expensive goods, there can be hundreds of rubles, thousands of rubles, millions of rubles, but anyway, after the third digit, purely psychologically by the majority of people, it is not perceived. And those who lived in the 1990s can remember that everyone became millionaires. Prices were from millions to kopecks. And what are millions? This is 10 to the 6th power. But still, in practice, we were guided by the first three digits in the price number. This is one aspect. The second aspect is related to the fact that if the economy is working, there are production technologies, there are transportation technologies, there is more or less perfect logistics, transport, then the amount of products that reaches the mass of end consumers, what is it conditioned by? The amount of production is conditioned by the amount of energy that we are able to load into the technological system. That is, we all study the law of conservation of energy at school. And this law was matched by the formula that the beneficial effect that we can get from the system is numerically equal to the energy conversion efficiency of this system multiplied by the amount of energy that we introduce into the system. Well, who of the scientists, economists, are able to prove that the law of conservation of energy does not work in the real sector of the economy, and that we can get a mass of goods in physical accounting more than we put energy into the production system, and more than we can get with this amount of energy conversion efficiency of the corresponding technologies? The reality is such that there is hardly anyone who can prove this without resorting to diabolical logic. Our real sector is subject to the law of conservation of energy in the same way as any mechanism that we use.
Наш реальный сектор подчинен закону сохранения энергии.
And accordingly, we get such an equality that on one side of the scale, we have a mass of goods, and on the other side of the scales, the amount of energy that was expended to produce this mass of goods. And the mass of goods has a certain evaluation at constant prices. Moreover, if we talk about the evaluation, then in the price of every product, two components can be detected: the cost of its production in a certain multi-sectoral production-consumption system, plus the claim for profit put forward by the owner of the product and its producer. And since all this mass of goods was produced within a year, then the exchange of products, that is, trade, was served by a certain amount of money supply. And accordingly, if you analyze it, you can get the ratio: the amount of money supply that served the exchange of products, the amount of energy that was expended to produce this money supply. What are the consequences of this approach? This has the following consequences. If we correlate the volume of the money supply with the volume of energy, then these equations and tables are in some form the presented energy balance of society, that is, the volumes of production and distribution of energy as such. Where does this lead? This leads to the fact that if we analyze the structure of the costs of sectors and the structure of expenditures of sectors, then the following circumstance becomes clear. It is possible to reveal the interconnection between the dynamics of changes in the money supply serving trade, both in the direction of its growth and in the direction of its contraction, with which there begins the collapse of economic ties in the multi-sectoral production system of society. Why? Because the speed of passing of the financial flow through the sector is connected with the duration of the cycle, ordering products and supplying them to the consumer. And let us imagine a situation where builders want to build something, that they can build something. The duration of the construction cycle of this structure is, say, 5 years. And so, in the 0 year, they make a business plan and say, we will build this, and we will need this, this, and this amount of different raw materials, components. So much will go to pay for this, plus a fund for wages such and such, taxes, and so on. And we are going to make a profit in the amount of such and such, and nominally, it will be the total cost of the project such and such. The orderer says, yes, I agree. They sign a contract and start construction. And Yegor Gaidar Or Viktor Gerashenko says, and now we will print money. And they do it. The reality is such that sectors with a long production cycle are not able to recoup for construction, because when additional money supply appears, it passes through a sector with short production cycles, and this leads to a general increase in the cost of everything in all sectors, including raw materials and components that are consumed by construction. If the construction industry has some kind of working capital, then, after the additional money supply appears, the purchasing power of this working capital immediately falls, and the project becomes unrealizable. The construction industry will collapse. Accordingly, the orderer of construction will not receive what he wants. And since he also wanted this for the implementation of his business plans, then things will not be fine for him. And, as a result, we will have the disintegration of economic ties, the same that we observed in the 1990s in Russia. Then they say, okay, let's not print extra money. The economy functions with the same amount of money supply which is, and there will be no disintegration of economic ties. Of course, there will. And where did you mislay the loan interest? The loan interest leads to an increase in the cost of production of all those who resort to credit loans. As a result, prices rise again, and since the money supply is tight, and there is an outflow of money into the banking sector, then in the real sector, the disintegration of economic ties takes place for the same reason. The purchasing power of working capital turns out to be insufficient to ensure the stability of the sector. What I said is, in fact, understandable. It can be shown accountingly strictly, on the basis of a primitive system of equations. And again the question arises, how much money is needed then? If you can't print extra money, you can't tighten the money supply either, then what to do? Here there arises another curious circumstance. Suppose that a student, say in grade 1 or 2, solves an arithmetic test, and he needs to do the addition of simple fractions. But in order to simplify the calculations, he ignores the denominators and adds and subtracts only the numerators. What the student will get is clear. Now, let us turn again to algebra. Here is the formula. Sigma, that is the sum of pi. Pi is the cash that every one of us has in our pockets or in current accounts. That is, the aggregate money supply, which is distributed over the current accounts and wallets of all physical and legal entities. What is it equal to? In reality, it is equal to what is emitted by the center of emission plus the volume of all emitted credit loans, excluding interest. Why? Because the reality is such that everyone evaluates their current purchasing power by the amount of cash available to them. Those who have taken out credit loans evaluate their current purchasing power, taking into account the fact that they have taken out credit loans, and those who have not taken out credit loans, and those whose money is in banks, they evaluate their purchasing power, taking into account the fact that at any time they can withdraw this money from the bank and spend it on something. The bank provides credit loans, exploiting the statistical regularity of the fact that if there is no exchange banking panic, then the simultaneous withdrawal of all accounts from the bank is excluded. We take and divide S by S. S is the money that was emitted by the emissional center, and we get the identical equality to 1. We can do both. We can divide S plus C by S plus C in the same way. And we also get identical equality to 1 for any S and for any C. And then any amount that any physical or legal entity has appears before us as the numerator of the fraction, in the denominator of which is S plus C. And this fraction, it is always less than 1. And now, imagine that the money supply, on account of the activity of banks or on account of the activity of the emissional center, in some way changes over the time interval in relation to which we conduct accounting reports and are engaged in analytical accounting at the micro level or at the macro level. And it turns out that all our accounting, under the conditions of change, S plus C, that is, the volume of the money supply, is the accounting of a student loan marker who neglects the denominators and conducts addition and subtraction operations only with numerators. If we take into consideration the denominators, what happens? It may turn out that we nominally get richer, but the part of your P in relation to S plus C is really decreasing, and you are really getting poorer. Because you own a smaller part of the total purchasing power of society than it used to be. So, the reality is such that if you have de-dimensionalized the financial credit system according to S plus C, then you are dealing with a unit of purchasing power of society which is distributed in different parts across the pockets and accounts of physical and legal entities, and all investments, all taxes, all volumes of investments in one or another sector are some parts of this unit. But after you have switched to the de-dimensionalized S plus C financial system, all verbal fornication on the theme that interest rates on credit loans are high because inflation is high ends. Because in this financial credit system, there is no inflation as such. Emission is impossible there. The total purchasing power is always 1. And there is only a question: into where and how are these parts distributed? And this is a very interesting question, into where and how the parts are distributed, because from the time that money appears in society, the prospects of this society are determined by what is financed by this money. If you finance lefty, then you will guaranteedly get scientific technological progress. If you finance secular lionesses, the construction of palaces and yachts by oligarchs, then the prospects will be very poor, because, in the best case, society will react to the decrease in the quality of life and the quality of governance by the soft transformation of the state and the reconfiguration of it for other objectives and ways of their realization. And, in the worst case, there will be a riot, with a very thorough cleansing of the entire current governing elite, when neither adults nor children will be spared. And this has happened many times in history. And there is only one reason. Not what was supposed to be funded was funded. And then you can look at this picture. What is in this picture? Here we have block A of the preceding table. This is the real sector of the economy. What is in it? There are raw material extractors and processors. And where does everything go? Everything goes into consumption. And what is this? And this is the hernia of the economy. This is what is called the speculative sector of the economy. As long as we exist in the nominal credit system, where rubles, dollars, and some other banknotes are circulating, that is, statistics, the real sector of the economy, trade turnover, amounted to that much. And in the speculative sector of the economy, trade turnover amounted to that much. And what is the turnover in the speculative sector of the economy? Fictitious values circulate there. Nothing really useful is produced. But the money supply is sucked out of the real sector, and someone makes incomes, profits from fluctuations in prices for goods of fictitious value. The incomes are considerable, exceeding the incomes in the real sector, and, above all, the incomes of the employees of the real sector. And it is believed that these people, who are successful financiers, are the salt of the earth, although they really do not create anything and do not really govern anything in the real sector. Even when they say that they are investors, it is a blatant lie, because the investment ends at the stage of the initial emission of shares. After the shares are bought for the first time, after that, there is only speculation with these shares. And the owner, the emitter of these shares, receives the money once, and there is no further emission into his production, into his activities related to these shares. Another thing is that in addition to this, shares are expressed in shares of the value of the company that emitted shares, and the right to receive dividends, if there are such dividends. But in most cases, speculation of shares generates income greater than the dividends on these shares. And the majority are interested in these shares as an object of speculation and as an instrument for the redistribution of property rights to real objects. And if, from the nominal financial credit system, we move again to the financial credit system, d-dimensionalized by S plus C, where the purchasing power is always equal to 1, what happens? It turns out that a certain part of this 1 serves the real economy, a certain part of this 1 serves the speculative sector. And the reality is such that the turnover of the speculative sector now exceeds the turnover of the real sector. That is, factually, all money circulates outside of production and works towards satisfying the parasitic requests of those connected with the speculative sector. In medicine, there are cases where the hernia leads people to death. Therefore, medicine believes that the hernia, in a timely manner, has to be cut out, without waiting for those situations where there will be a strangulated hernia, and in the hernia, there begins a process of neurosis of tissues. Economists believe that the hernia of the economy is the engine of the economy, that the hernia of the speculative economy is an instrument of governance towards this economy. And how is the hernia connected with the real sector? It is connected, again, through these same equations of intersectoral balance, through balance models. How is it connected? It is connected the same way as unjustified emission or tightening of the money supply. Why? Because between the real sector and the hernia, there is always some kind of flow of money supply, and as soon as this flow goes beyond some critical parameters, regardless of the direction of this flow, in the real sector, the working capital begins to lose its purchasing power. And this is followed by the collapse of all economic ties if the financial crisis continues to grow. Moreover, I would like to draw your attention to the fact that the collapse of the real sector, as a consequence of the collapse of economic ties, under the impact of all sorts of financial troubles, it is in no way connected with the real needs of society for this or that product. And when economists say that there is a crisis of overproduction, this is again a lie. Because if there is a crisis of overproduction, then in the country there can be no hungry, homeless, walking in rags people, all children should guaranteedly receive education, and so on and so forth. Therefore, the reality is that all the economic calculations acquire metrological consistency only in a dimensionless S plus C financial credit system when correlating this one of aggregate purchasing power of society with the energy potential that society can put in its production system. If we count in a nominal way, then we guaranteedly get the incomparability of economic calculations. There is such historical evidence. Allegedly, Peter Alexeyevich Romanov, that is, Peter the Great, was taught blacksmithing by a blacksmith in Tula. Since Peter was a student with him, then, as a student during his training, Peter honestly earned 19 kopecks. With these 19 kopecks, Peter bought himself boots, and he and the blacksmith also drank and ate, thereby celebrating the completion of the educational process and the receipt of a certain qualification level by Peter. Now, go to the store, buy yourself good leather boots. It is unlikely that Peter bought some crap, and it's unlikely that anyone would dare to sell him crap. For 19 kopecks, buy yourself boots, and then go to a cafe or a restaurant and celebrate the purchase with the rest of the money with your friends. Therefore, when they say, here are rubles, here are kopecks, what stands behind this? In reality, each era has its own behind this. And then another question arises. There was an economist named Ludwig Erhard. During Adenauer's chancellorship, he pulled the Federal Republic of Germany out of the economic devastation that followed the end of World War II. Ludwig Erhard wrote the book Prosperity Through Competition, in which he described his activities as an economist. In this book, at least in its Russian translation, there is no phrase that can be found on the internet. The phrase said by Ludwig Erhard: "Inflation is an utterly immoral thing, a theft from the body of the people, that they share not blame for the rise in prices. Who else? Is the loss of the value of money a natural phenomenon, or the work of fools?" I would like to hear from the State Duma members and from the government objections to Ludwig Erhard. Moreover, the situation is complicated by the fact that Ludwig Erhard was a practicing economist, a successful practitioner, unlike Gaidar and Chubais. He was one of the creators of the economic miracle of the Federal Republic of Germany in the 1950s. Again, liberals do not like Joseph Vissarionovich Stalin. The fact is that Joseph Vissarionovich was also a practicing economist, and also successful, because according to the British Encyclopedia, Stalin inherited Russia with a wooden plow and left it in possession of atomic weapons. Joseph Vissarionovich believed that the normal mode of functioning of the economy is a systematic decrease in prices to the measure of satisfaction of social needs by the economy. And he saw the growth in the well-being of the peoples of the USSR, not only in the form of an increase in the income of the population. He saw this in the form of a systematic reduction in prices for goods and services, and he brought the economy of the Soviet Union into this mode. And the economy functioned in this mode. There is another aspect that is related to the question of how much money is needed in circulation, because regardless of whether we are situated in a nominal financial credit system or not in nominal accounting, we always have a nominal emission, and the question of the volume of emission arises. Emission can be such that it outpaces the energy supply capacity of this one of the aggregate purchasing power. If the emission is ahead, the nominal prices will rise. And if the emission lags behind the growth of energy supply capacity of production, then what will happen? And then it will turn out like this. If, in the system, we don't have interest on the loan as the generator of price growth, then the prices will decrease. Let's look at each of these variants from the point of view of Ostap Ibrahimovich Bender or Pavel Ivanovich Chichikov. If prices rise, there is a money supply that is not backed by goods coverage. Ostap Ibrahimovich or Pavel Ivanovich is not obliged to go to work and make any product. But before them, the opportunity is open to make money, profit, and, on this basis, to be in the first rows of consumers. And if Ostap Ibrahimovich finds himself in the financial credit system, where real sectors work for the current interests of the population, production volumes grow, needs are guaranteedly satisfied, prices go down. What should Ostap Ibrahimovic do?
Потребности гарантированно удовлетворяются, цены снижаются. Чем?
There is really nothing for him to do, nothing with which to scheme. He has to go into the real sector. To live well in this system, one needs to go into the real sector. And, in order to live better than those around, one needs to improve professionalism. And now let's look at the same thing from the point of view not of Ostap Ibrahimovic, but from the point of view of an employee in the real sector. It doesn't matter whether he works on a machine, advances fundamental science, teaches children at school, cures adults or children, he goes to work and gets paid. Then, there are two variants. The salary is so small that it does not allow him to make savings. Prices are going up. What will happen? Living honestly on a salary is worse from year to year. What is the point of maintaining the system? So where to go? If he has brains, he can go and become a revolutionary. If he has no brains, then a corrupt official or a criminal. If, after all, at the starting moment, the salary is such that it allows him to make savings, what happens? Prices rise, the part of savings decreases, those savings that were depreciate, lose their purchasing power. In the end, the moment comes that it's no longer possible to make savings. He spends the money from his savings. What to do? If he has brains, he can go and become a revolutionary. If he has no brains, then a corrupt official or a criminal. Or, if there is absolutely nothing at all, then he becomes a drinker and so on. In other words, the reality is such that if the economy functions in such a way that there is no interest on the loan, and emission lags behind the growth of energy supply capacity and scientific technological progress, then the volume of products offered for consumption grows on account of the growth of production. Prices go down. The purchasing power of salaries grows, even if you are not making a career, but have reached your professional ceiling. And even if this ceiling, for various reasons, turns out to be at the lowest level, that is, of a laborer or a cleaning lady, you still live better year after year, because your salary ensures the further growth in purchasing power. In fact, it turns out that a system based on collective professional labor can be effective only if there is no interest on credit loans. And emission lags behind the scientific technological progress and production growth, thanks to which purchasing power grows. And, accordingly, no financial oligarchy takes shape on account of all sorts of speculations that parasitize on someone else's labor. And if, again, we return to the structure of these equations allow us to answer the question, what gross capacity should be in order to get such a final product? Here there immediately arise two questions. What should the final product be in order for everyone to live well? On account of what and how are the production capacities increased? The answer to the second question is simple. In the structure of the final product, one can single out what are called investment products. These are industrial equipment, completed construction objects that are produced in the cycle under consideration, which describes the balance model, but the returns on which will be obtained in the subsequent production cycles. That is, in the aspect of economic development, these investment products are a governing impact on the macroeconomic system. There are statistics that allow us to answer the question: if we invest that much in the production of investment products, then what increase in production volumes will these investment products give in the corresponding sectors? It directly relates to the task of the stability of the behavior of the object of governance in terms of predictability. That is, the task can be solved. For this, there is everything. One just needs to use it. Another question is more interesting: how to predict the aggregate of the final product that is oriented towards the satisfaction of social needs of a non-production character. There is also an answer to this question here. You can look at such a picture, which shows certain algorithmics. If we have certain needs, the needs entail production for the satisfaction of these needs. And then we can analyze the consequences of production itself and the consequences of satisfaction of the needs. And, accordingly, we have three more statistics that are correlated with the identifiers useful and harmful. That is, production for the satisfaction of needs can itself be harmful. For example, everything related to nuclear energy, although it gives energy, all the accompanying effects are nonetheless harmful. Those who doubt, please search the internet for the work of A.V. Yablokov on the theme Atomic Myths. Everything can be learned about the consequences of small doses and large doses, and about the methods of processing radioactive waste, and so on. And the consequences of dissatisfaction can be harmful, and it can be harmful in two ways. If you drink alcohol, it is harmful for you in any dose. It is the destruction of genetics, a threat to your children. If you start working drunk, or get some kind of pleasure, then there are variants. You will become the cause of an accident in which you, other people, and some objects will suffer. And it turned out that according to the statistics of Soviet times, for 1 ruble of budget income that the USSR received from the sale of alcohol, according to various estimates, there was from 3 to 5 rubles of damage that was amenable to accounting. The scheme is simple. A bottle of vodka, 4.12 rubles. You drank it up, got behind the wheel of a Kamaz. You crashed the Kamaz worth 30,000, plus something else. If you spread it over the whole society, it is from 3 to 5 rubles of damage, amenable to accounting. But there is more damage that is not amenable to accounting. For example, at the beginning of the 1960s, one school for mentally disabled children was enough for a city with a population of 200,000. That is, those who were conceived by the drunk, or who received birth injuries, or there were some other reasons by strength of which they could not study in an ordinary school. Now, in a city with a population of 200,000, one school for the mentally disabled is not enough. In the late 1950s and early 1960s, if in a kindergarten someone from the group in the middle of the day was taken to a speech therapist, then this was an event that the person was considered unique. Now many kindergartens provide a position of a speech therapist. Talking about the fact that not everything that we consume is useful, or it's not useful when we consume too little or when we consume too much. These are not empty words. If we analyze these statistics, then all needs can be divided into two large categories: demographically conditioned needs, the satisfaction of which is really necessary for the life of adults, for the upbringing of children, and for them to receive an education, and all this together is necessary for the stable development of society in harmony with nature. And those needs that we, after all, satisfy by force of the fact that there are cultural traditions or creative extremism is off scale. I want to try something that I have not tried before. This is accompanied by harm for the consumer, producers, people around, and descendants. These needs can be called degradational parasitic. And then they say that there is a science of economic cybernetics. All governance everywhere is based on the fact that we are able to distinguish between the vector of objectives and inherent noises and interference from the outside, which are in the process of governance. So, comrades economic cyberneticians, tell us how in economics to distinguish between the vector of objectives of governance and inherent noises and interference from the outside. This is not something outrageous. It is not like we want to find fault with you. This is simply ordinary governerial literacy, on the basis of which the processes of governance in military affairs and in civil affairs are built. And economic cybernetics has existed for decades. And there is no clear answer to this question in any treatise on economic cybernetics. Actually, one can write a very thick book on the theme governance in the economy and never once touch upon the question of how society generates a vector of objectives in relation to the governance towards the macroeconomic systems. How to distinguish between the vector of objectives and inherent noises and interference from the outside in macroeconomic processes. That is, it is an outrageous governerial illiteracy. The answer to this question is simple. After you have analyzed all the needs, and they have been distributed into two classes, then everything that relates to the demographically conditioned needs is a vector of objectives of governance, and accordingly, this is a useful return of the macroeconomic system. That is, one of the parts within each F of the final product. That is, the final product, structurally, is the production of satisfaction of demographically conditioned needs. Degradational parasitic needs of production in the interests of their satisfaction. These are inherent noises and interference from the outside, and plus investment products, which are the governing impact in relation to the macroeconomic system. It turns out that we must press down the degradational parasitic needs, both economically and by other social cultural means, of all 6 priorities of the generalized means of governance and weaponry. And we must invest in the development of the real sector in such a way that over time, the production-consumption system reaches the level of guaranteed and complete satisfaction of demographically conditioned needs. Here a hysteria may begin on the theme that demographically conditioned needs are unpredictable, that scientific technological progress is unpredictable, therefore, all balance models are governerially worthless. Alright, let's handle this question. How much food did one person need for healthy nutrition 2000 years ago? Based on the weight of his body, it was about the same as today. The physiology has not changed. The next question is, how much useful energy was required to bake a ton of bread 2000 years ago? The answer is the same. As much was required as now. The difference is only in the sources of energy and in the energy conversion efficiency of the stove. But the useful energy, which is used to make bread, was as much back then as it is now. If, for example, 1,000 children have been born in a settlement this year, how many places in a nursery will be required in 2 years? Most likely around 990. Because a certain number of children will die, natural mortality, it is inevitable, and someone will stay at home and will not go to the nursery school. It turns out that all that I said about demographically conditioned needs, these are just examples that show that demographically conditioned needs are predictable for a century ahead, provided that you have clear demographic politics. That is, demographic politics are not dictated by the economy. Gaidar, Chubais, Gerashenko exercised the economy in the 1990s, the economic genocide began, and demographic problems arose. But in an intellectually healthy society, the economy serves demographic politics. And demographic politics is such that everyone gets the right upbringing, the highest educational level, from those that the era requires. Everything happens within the demographic niche, the ecological niche that the biosphere allows, and society lives in harmony with nature. If we proceed from this, then it turns out that we have to move to this picture. This is the ideal demographic pyramid. On the one side, females, on the other side, males. The shaded area is labor resources, but the real demographic pyramid of Russia is terrible. It generally looks like a Christmas tree, from which the crown branches have been ripped out on a number of levels of the pyramid. Reasons. The consequences of the revolution and the Civil War. A demographic pit. Someone died. The dead did not give birth in their time to those who could have been born. The Great Patriotic War. Again, a demographic pit behind it, and again, no giving birth by those who died to subsequent generations of children and grandchildren. The 1990s. Thanks to the liberals for the economic genocide, which led to another demographic catastrophe. What happens if you put the demographic pyramid on its side and correlate its axis with the chronological axis? Then we can have an extrapolation of the birth rate in all age groups with some approximation, given a certain demographic policy, the shape of a demographic pyramid for any year in the future. If correlated with demographically conditioned needs, then they are divided into three categories. Personal, the volume of production of their satisfaction is proportional to the size of the population in the corresponding age groups, taking into account characteristics of the sexes. The next group is family. The volume of production is proportional to the number of families of every type, which can be distinguished in social statistics. And since the life of society in a technical civilization is tied to infrastructures, there are also infrastructural needs. Well, they can also be predicted, taking into account the density of the population, the nature of the distribution of the population by types of family, correspondingly, by the method of employment of the population, and the tie to the area of industrial enterprises and agricultural production. So, the reality is such that if we have some standards, and the standards, this is not necessary to dress everyone in cotton wool padded jackets, because look at the 114 elements of the periodic table of Mendeleev and a variety around us. That is, standards are the basis for mass production to ensure that the needs of everyone are satisfied. Another thing is that the range of standards should be such that the bulk of consumers fit into it, and those who don't fit in could receive some kind of unique thing for a reasonable price. So, if for us the needs are predictable for decades ahead, then the input-output balance equation, taking into account the fact that the vector of the final product consists of three components: demographically conditioned products, degradational parasitic products, investment products, allows us to prepare in advance the production base for complete and guaranteed satisfaction of demographically conditioned needs on the basis of an existing or developed system of standards. If we talk about the structure of this task of bringing the production system to a guaranteed satisfaction of the demographically conditioned needs of society over time, then this task is structurally mathematically analogous to the task of hitting a slowly maneuvering target with a homing projectile.
Эта задача
This task is solved in the
выросла
interests
в
of the military-industrial
решается.
complex.
С начала
But
50-х
since the
годов
beginning of the
существует
1950s,
три.
there are three parameters in the space of parameters:
И трехмерная
three-dimensional
пространство
space
задача
in air
второго
defense and
будущего.
missile defense tasks, and three-dimensional
Задача
space
решается
in
успешно
anti-submarine
в
defense
темпе
tasks.
реального времени.
This task is solved successfully in real time. The only difficulty is the increase in dimensionality with the transition to the economic analog of this task. Because the parameter space is the entire product nomenclature that is taken into account in the balance model. But on the other hand, there are supercomputers and there is time. Because the plan for the next 5 years does not have to be presented tomorrow. In order to consider and correct it, it is sufficient if it's presented in a year or two. And if we deal with the development of this theme, then there is something with which to load the scientific research institutes and the faculties of applied mathematics and processes of governance. This is no longer a matter of someone alone, because the result should be a state standard of algorithms for collecting and processing economic information, oriented towards solving the task of ensuring economic safety in a broad sense, that is, taking into account biospheric ecological, demographic, and actually economic aspects. It should be noted that balance models are omnivorous. In what sense are they omnivorous? You can include in them the consumption and restoration of natural resources. You can consider population reproduction as one of the industries, and accordingly, depending on what you want to get as a result, at the output, you will get functionally operable algorithmics. One thing is required of you to ensure its metrological consistency. This is achieved on the basis of the correlation of the financial system with the energy potential, which is input in the economy, and the representation of intersectoral and interregional product exchange in balance models as a process of energy exchange. But nevertheless, one more question remains. The predictability of scientific technological progress and its consideration in planning. Let us begin with general questions first. In what does scientific technological progress manifest itself in relation to the economy? In the growth of the energy supply capacity of production, the increase in energy conversion efficiency, the emergence of many new technologies, the production of certain products, the emergence of new products. And any new product can arise only when it turns out to be economically more profitable than the existing one. In what sense? The cost price of its production should be lower than the cost price of production of analogs. That is, in the competition with analogs in terms of cost effectiveness, it should win. It should satisfy some of the needs of people, no worse than analogs, but it should be cheaper in production, or, with the same production cost price, it should be superior in its consumer qualities. That is, anyway, everything is described in terms of energy consumption. The second question is, what do you want from the plan? The flaw of the Soviet planning system was that the plan set the exact values of what had to be at the output, and the competition was oriented towards surpassing the plan. Now let's go back to these equations. What does it mean to surpass the plan in one sector? This means that this sector must consume more products produced by other sectors. And accordingly, if it is not a supplier of final products, but a supplier of products for other sectors, then the question arises, are the sector's consumers of its products able to process what it will supply them? In other words, the question again arises. The question about the disintegration of economic ties due to the emergence of various kinds of imbalances in the national economy. The Soviet system in this aspect was initially vicious, because it reached the point where, according to the reporting, the plant was built. But, in reality, the zero cycle had not yet been completed. The second question is related to the fact that if we plan in such a way that the plan is tensioned, then the national economy can only jump over it as if over a record bar. That is, the plan is tensioned, and if it is over-tensioned, it does not have a margin of stability in the event of someone not being able to fulfill it. The disintegration of economic ties and non-fulfillment of the plan as a whole will begin again. So, it turns out that the plan should initially be clearly non-tensioned. It must set the minimums of production below which it should not fall in any of the sectors, in any of the regions, if this is a plan based on intersectoral balances or interregional ones. The plan should set that below which it must not be. With long-term planning, we can completely neglect scientific technological progress with this approach. Why? Because we can say that we are not interested in the concretics of the technology of the future. We are only interested in the fact that we, guaranteedly, reach the level of production with current technologies no later than such and such a date. And this level of production allows us to satisfy social needs no later than a certain date. If there is scientific technological progress, then we will satisfy these needs either earlier, or we will satisfy them at a higher quality level within the planned time frame. But if there is scientific technological progress, then we change the entire set of coefficients in this very matrix, in the equations, or in the table that describes production. This means that the structure of payments for functionally conditioned expenditures of every one of the enterprises and every one of the sectors should also have a certain margin of stability in relation to price fluctuations and everything else. This poses the question of the purpose-oriented construction of a chart of accounts as an instrument of macroeconomic governance. But the reality is such that no one has dealt with this theme, although charts of accounts have been around for many decades. Nevertheless, depending on what structure of functionally conditioned expenditures of enterprises is set by the chart of accounts of accounting, and how the legislation on economic and financial activities regulates transfers within this structure, society can either develop or degrade. But if the economy has a certain margin of stability, then the maintenance of guaranteed financial stability of sectors, which allows us to produce everything that we need, is achieved by means of the tax grant mechanism, plus the government fixing of a certain number of prices and tariffs at a fixed level, since they are basic, and their change entails a change, and a significant one, of all other prices. What can be attributed to these basic ones? The cost of energy consumption and primary energy carriers, plus transport tariffs and some other tariffs. Now, if it is regulated by the state, then everything else can be regulated by the market mechanism. But at the same time, the state should retain the right to regulate the thresholds of profitability of production in sectors and regions, distributing grants, subsidies, and varying tax rates. Why? Because the required volumes of production can be unrealizable with spontaneously emerging prices in the market. Because the closer society is to satisfying needs, the lower the price of the corresponding type of product should fall. Because at the macroeconomic level, price is an indicator of a deficiency of products in relation to free consumption. The economy is developing in this direction, but to talk about what Marx has said, that money will disappear, would be wrong. For the simple reason that the financial credit system is an instrument of structureless macroeconomic governance, and, in addition, it is an instrument of statistical accounting and analysis of what is happening in the economy over historically long intervals of time, on condition that finance is correlated with energy potential or with gold or something else, but not like it is now, when the dollar is the value itself. But where it comes from and how, this is not a theme for discussion. The circumstance that the economy is really developing in this direction is evidenced by the fact that in Switzerland, the emission of unconditional income was discussed. That is, the volume of a certain amount of money that every Swiss citizen should receive, regardless of whether he works or does not work, whether he is healthy or a disabled person. But he should receive this amount, which could be used by him at his discretion. In other words, it is assumed that creative potential and its realization is a subjective need of people. And even if people receive this guaranteed unconditional income, they will continue to work with interest and realize their creative potential, including in the economic sphere. But all this requires different economic theories. What I have said here is not even the basics. These are just the prerequisites and principles that must be developed in these economic theories. If we talk about when they should have been developed, then Joseph Vissarionovich Stalin in 1952, in Economic Problems of Socialism in the USSR, directly set the task, the building of a new economic theory that would adequately satisfy the needs of socialist construction in our country and the transition to communism. That is, to the complete and guaranteed satisfaction of demographically conditioned needs in harmony with nature. But they believed that Stalin was a despot, a tyrant, an undereducated seminarian. But if you think about it, subsequent practice shows that he was one of the smartest and most dobrous people of his era, whose worldview, world understanding, for 150 years outstripped the intellectual development of society. And since they did not begin to engage in this at that time, then now we will have to do it. Because, as Christ said in his time, an evil and adulterous generation seeketh after a sign, but there shall be no sign given to it, but the sign of the prophet Jonas. The sign of the prophet Jonas. The prophet Jonas decided that he was smarter than the Almighty, and that he did not have to fulfill the promised by him mission of preaching in Nineveh, the capital of the then Assyria. After that, Jonas is swallowed by a certain cetacean, in which he stays for some time. When Jonas bethought himself and prayed, the cetacean was instructed to spit Jonas onto the shore. Jonas came to his senses and went to Nineveh. The inhabitants of Nineveh heeded the sermons, changed their minds, and Assyria existed for a certain amount of time. But if we move from the personal scale of Jonas to the universal scale, all humanity, then humanity, having subjugated itself to the biblical project of enslaving it on behalf of God, came into conflict with the Almighty. The consequence of this conflict is a global, biospheric social and ecological crisis, the development of which will guaranteedly destroy the current civilization. The only alternative to this suicide is to bethink oneself, to oppose the biblical project of globalization with an alternative project of globalization, which would flow in the stream of God's providence and ensure both the development of humanity and the stability of the biosphere. In the stream of this project, whether you like it or not, we will have to create alternative sociological economic theories, which should be based on the 6 categories of objective laws about which I spoke last time, to which the life of human society is subordinated and which should be governerially consistent. And we will have to live according to them. But if someone believes that nothing can be done, everything will change for the better somehow by itself, this is his right. But then he should not ask about the reasons why something doesn't change for the better in life. There is bad luck, something is wrong, or there are some threats to life. Humanoid bandologs have no right to exist, since they are parasites on the planet. And the Earth should become a planet of humans, ceasing to be a planet of monkeys. That's it for today.